What if the family meant to protect you was the one that erased you? Madeline Whitman was born into wealth, but never into love. Banished by her father, silenced by her sister, and told her mother was gone forever, she built her future from the ashes of betrayal. Years later, with a revolutionary invention in hand and secrets buried in corporate vaults, she returns not for revenge, but for truth. This is the story of how one woman uncovered the lies that destroyed her family and built an empire they could never control. What they buried in silence, she reclaimed in power. The marble floor beneath her heels felt colder than it ever had before. Madeline Whitman stood in the grand foyer of the Whitman estate, still dressed in her Navy graduation gown, the silver stole from MIT brushing lightly against her wrist. She clutched her diploma tightly, creased now from the rain, and stared at the man who had once promised her the world. David Whitman didn't even glance at the diploma. His arms were crossed over his chest, tailored shirt sleeves rolled just above the wrist, Rolex visible as always, ticking like a metronome of disapproval. The room was silent, save for the distant clicking of Julia's heels upstairs and the faint hum of the chandelier lights overhead. "I spent 4 years building something that matters," Madeline said, her voice sharp but beginning to crack. "I graduated top of my class. You didn't even send a message." David's mouth tightened, the only visible shift in his otherwise impenetrable face. "You studied energy systems. That's cute," he said, walking past her toward the sitting room. "But don't expect me to clap for a fantasy." She followed, stunned. "Fantasy? You think the world runs on passion and potential? No, it runs on control, on legacy." He paused, turned, and looked at her for the first time. "You're not part of this family anymore, Madeline. You made that choice when you walked away from the name that built you." "No," she whispered. "You made that choice when you erased my mother." The temperature in the room dropped. David's expression didn't change, but the shift in his posture, stiffer, more closed, was telling. "Don't speak of things you don't understand. She was my mother. She was a liability," he snapped, "and you're not much better. Honestly, a daughter like you is better off polishing chandeliers for others. At least then you'd be useful." The words sliced deeper than she could admit. Madeline stood frozen as he stepped closer, pulled a folded wad of bills from his coat and tossed it at her feet. The cash hit the floor with a quiet thud, fanning out like the remains of something once whole. "That's all you'll get from me. I suggest you start over. Far from here." Madeline didn't move. The silence between them swelled, filled with years of neglect, of unanswered questions and unmet gazes. She bent down, not for the money, but because her knees trembled. As her fingers grazed the floor, she saw it, something partially wedged beneath the coat rack. A small, yellowed envelope, creased with age, her name handwritten on the front in careful, slanted script. She slipped it into her coat pocket before rising. "I hope you remember this moment," she said quietly, not for his benefit, but for her own. "Because I will." She turned and walked out without another word, leaving the money untouched on the floor. Outside, the rain had picked up again, soaking her graduation gown as she crossed the circular driveway. The Whitman estate loomed behind her like a mausoleum, all cold stone and secrets. She didn't look back. At the bus stop, Madeline finally opened the envelope. Inside was a note, torn from a personal notepad. In faded blue ink, the message read, "Find Gloria Harper. She knew your mother. She knows the truth." The handwriting wasn't David's, and it definitely wasn't Julia's. Madeline folded the note with deliberate care, tucked it into the pocket beside her diploma, and boarded the next bus leaving Brook. The rain followed her down the windows, like the world weeping for something she could no longer feel. The bus jolted as it left Brooklyn behind, the city skyline retreating like a memory she hadn't chosen to keep. Madeline sat near the back, soaked to the skin, graduation cap tucked under her arm, the scent of rain clinging to her. No one on the bus looked at her twice. She was just another girl with tired eyes and nowhere to go. She stared down at the note again, her fingers tracing the shaky handwriting. Find Gloria Harper. The name stirred something in her. Faint, like a dream she used to have before everything had been smothered under silence and scorn. Her mother's name had never been spoken again after she disappeared. Not at family dinners, not at birthdays, not even when Madeline was old enough to ask why there were no photographs of her in the house. She leaned her head against the window, watching the drops slide down like tiny races to the frame. Her reflection looked older than 24, and maybe it was. Some people had birthday cakes and warm hands on their shoulders at graduation. Madeline had a rain-soaked eviction, a crumpled wad of cash, and a father who'd buried her alive in expectation and legacy. The bus dropped her off in Queens, where she'd been crashing in a sublet apartment near an old college friend's place. Not that she could call it crashing anymore, it was more like surviving, stringing days together with freelance tech jobs and working late shifts at a library help desk. The walk from the bus stop was short, but her legs were heavier than they should have been. Each step felt like dragging the weight of a last name she no longer wanted to carry. When she reached the apartment, she peeled off the wet gown and hung it near the window to dry. Her small room had a mattress on the floor, 2 suitcases, a desk that wobbled, and a laptop that whirred like it had asthma. She plugged it in, dropped onto the mattress, and Googled the name Gloria Harper, Cambridge, Massachusetts, law office, closed. Former partner, Whitman Holdings, disbarred 2003. Madeline blinked. Disbarred? Her heart thudded. The only lawyer her mother had ever trusted, someone who had worked for the very empire that cast her out, had been removed from the bar. No articles. Explained why. No scandal, no statement, just a quiet erasure, like a puzzle piece that had been pocketed by someone before she could complete the picture. She searched deeper. Buried in an old legal directory, she found a last known address. Not a corporate suite in Manhattan or a Boston townhouse, just a line of text at the bottom of the page. G. Harper, S14, Gray Birch Lane, Cambridge, MA. She whispered the address aloud, letting the syllables linger in the room like a spell. A real place. A lead, maybe the only one she had. The air in the room suddenly felt charged. The kind of stillness right before a circuit comes alive. She stood, changed out of her damp clothes, and began to pack, not out of desperation, but resolve. Before she zipped her backpack shut, she paused, then turned to her desk. From a drawer, she retrieved a folded sheet of paper, her rejected job offer from Whitman Holdings, filed under family consideration, it had said. Beneath it, her final design sketch for a prototype battery system she'd been building in secret. She tucked both into her bag, along with the note about Gloria Harper. Madeline stepped out into the hallway and locked the door behind her. The key clicked with a finality that made her chest ache. This time, she wasn't leaving because she was forced out. She was choosing to go. Madeline stood behind the counter at Willow Beans, her apron already stained with espresso and oat milk. The mid-morning rush had faded, leaving behind the low hum of lo-fi music and the smell of burnt beans from an overused grinder. Outside, San Jose bustled with engineers in hoodies and investors in crisp chinos, all chasing something just out of reach. Inside, it was quieter, until the door chimed. Mia Turner entered the way she always did, like the world was just another improv stage waiting for her cue. Her wavy hair was half-pinned, her notebook balanced under one arm, and a pencil stuck behind her ear like a forgotten thought. "You look like you've been through a double shift in hell," Mia said, sliding into the bar stool opposite Madeline. "I have. 3 oat milk lattes, 2 arguments over Wi-Fi speed, and 1 guy who tried to pay with Dogecoin." Mia laughed, that easy sound that made things feel a little less heavy. That's Silicon Valley for you. Madeline smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The truth was, she hadn't slept much the past week. Her nights were spent bent over a rickety desk in the corner of her studio apartment, wires and circuit boards splayed like bones across the surface. She'd been fine-tuning the energy storage prototype she'd dreamed up during her junior year at MIT. The design for Astrovolt Core 1 wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And now, slowly, painfully, it was coming alive. She pulled off her apron and joined Mia at the bar as the last customer left. Mia flipped open her sketchbook, revealing a rough doodle of a girl holding lightning in her bare hands. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be me? Mia grinned. Maybe. You've got that don't mess with me unless you can wire a lithium node look. Madeline rolled her eyes, but the compliment warmed her more than she'd admit. She looked out the window at the tangle of tech offices down the street. Just last week, she had stood in line outside one of them, Daniel's Tech, during a startup networking night. Everyone else had name tags and business cards. She had nothing but a flash drive and the elevator pitch she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times. That's when she saw him. Alex Daniels. Young, calculated, already infamous for betting on unlikely founders and turning them into stars. He'd walked past her once, didn't stop. Then, 10 minutes later, he circled back. Energy storage? He'd asked, without introduction. Beyond lithium, she replied. He had raised an eyebrow, intrigued. That's a big claim. I don't need you to believe in it, she'd said. Just give me 5 minutes. Alex didn't say yes, but he didn't walk away either. Today, she still hadn't heard back. Madeline exhaled, rubbed her temples. I think I'm close, Mia. The numbers are almost where they should be, but I'm out of time. Rent's due, the prototype's glitching, and I've been eating instant noodles for 12 days. Mia tore a page from her notebook and slid it over. Then maybe it's time to stop doing this alone. Go back to Daniel's Tech. Crash their next demo day. What's the worst that could happen? Madeline didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the counter where a customer had left behind an old folded newspaper. Something about the headline snagged her attention. Madeline Whitman, heiress or ghost? An unsolved mystery from Manhattan's most private family. Her blood ran cold. She unfolded the page slowly, staring at the grainy photo of a woman with dark eyes and soft features, almost identical to the reflection Madeline saw every morning. Madeline folded the newspaper slowly, as if it might crumble to dust in her hands. The headline kept echoing in her mind like a scratched record. Madeline Whitman, heiress or ghost. The article was dated nearly 2 decades ago, a puff piece more speculation than substance, but it mentioned Gloria Harper by name. A trusted family legal advisor, abruptly disbarred in 2003 without public explanation. Her pulse ticked louder in her ears. The name Evelyn had been banned in the Whitman house. For years she'd thought that was just David's way of grieving, or avoiding grief. But now, looking into the face in the photo, Madeline wasn't so sure. She looked too much like her. The slope of the jaw, the curve of the brows, even the quiet sadness in the eyes. It was like staring into a mirror from another lifetime. Mia leaned over, catching a glimpse of the image. Is that your... I don't know, Madeline said too quickly. It could be. Mia didn't push. Instead, she scribbled something in her notebook and then tore the corner off the page. There's a startup demo night at Daniel's Tech tomorrow. You've got 5 minutes with him if you can get through the pitch circle. Take it. Madeline stared at the address. A chance. A door. Later that night in her dimly lit studio, she sat cross-legged on the worn rug, the prototype resting beside her like a half-breathing machine. The circuits hummed faintly. Her notes were spread out across the floor, layers of ideas, calculations, and crude sketches pinned with colored tabs. Her laptop showed 3 tabs open: data simulations, the article about Evelyn, and a property record for a closed office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 14 Grey Birch Lane, Gloria Harper's last known location. Her eyes flicked between the data set on her model and the article, as if one would unlock the other. Her mind raced. Was Evelyn pushed out of the family the same way Madeline had been? Was her disappearance truly a tragedy, or had it been orchestrated, quietly buried under money and contracts? If Gloria had answers, Madeline needed them. But first, she had to survive tomorrow. The next evening, Madeline stood across the street from the Daniels Tech building, clutching the flash drive in her coat pocket so tightly her knuckles ached. The pitch circle was already forming inside, people in suits and sweatshirts, tablets in hand, dreams in their mouths. She stepped through the glass doors like she belonged, her boots clicking on the polished floors. Her name wasn't on any list, but that didn't stop her. She weaved past the clusters of founders until she spotted him. Alex Daniels, standing with a glass of soda in one hand, scanning the room like a shark watching for movement. She approached, hard pounding, flash drive still clenched in her palm. He looked up as she neared, recognition flashing behind his eyes. "Didn't think you'd show," he said flatly. "I didn't think I'd get another chance." Alex studied her for a beat. "You've got 5 minutes." They stepped into a side hallway, away from the crowd. Madeline plugged the flash drive into his tablet and began, her voice steady but urgent. She outlined the problem with current lithium storage, the risks, the inefficiencies, the waste. Then she walked him through her model, layer by layer, pulse by pulse, until her words gave way to numbers, data, validation. Alex said nothing for a long moment. Then he handed the tablet back. "Impressive, but you're still just theory." "I'll build it," she said, breathless. "Just give me a chance," he smirked. "You've got one shot. Show me something real, and I'll listen." That night, as she walked home through the silent city, the wind biting at her cheeks, Madeline felt something new blooming inside her. Not pride, not hope, but fury sharpened into purpose. Tomorrow she would build the future, and after that, she would find the truth. The lab was barely more than a glorified storage closet tucked behind a repair shop in East San Jose. But to Madeline, it was a sanctuary. Old server racks lined the walls like fossilized machines. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting pale light over a cluttered workbench covered in soldering wires, notebooks, and half-finished circuit boards. The floor creaked every time she shifted her weight, and the heater hadn't worked properly in weeks. But in this room, no one told her she didn't belong. She stared at the simulation running on her laptop screen. The algorithm flickered between green and amber, a progress bar inching along with maddening slowness. Her design for Astrovolt Core 1 had passed preliminary models. Now came the stress test, the test that would decide whether she had anything real to show Alex. A knock sounded at the door. She looked up, startled, then relaxed when Mia slipped inside with a paper cup of black coffee. "You look like you haven't slept since Tuesday," Mia said, setting the cup down beside the keyboard. "I haven't. Remind me again, why are you doing this to yourself?" Madeline didn't answer right away. She rubbed her hands together, fingertips calloused from too many late nights rewiring circuits. "Because this is it. If I blow this shot, I don't get another one." Mia sat down across from her, arms folded. "You already showed him data. He wants more than data, he wants proof." Madeline gestured to the humming prototype in the corner, encased in a clear acrylic box. Inside, the molecular battery array glowed faintly, its delicate layers pulsing like a heartbeat. "I get one shot to make him believe I'm not just another dreamer with numbers and a sob story." Mia watched her carefully. "Is this really about the battery, or is this about your father?" Madeline flinched. The question landed too close to the truth. She looked away, her voice low. It's about never being invisible again. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window. A sudden gust rattled the glass. Madeline stood, crossed the room, and opened a drawer. From it she pulled a weathered folder, her old design sketches from MIT. Scribbled equations, diagrams, stations in blue pen from a professor she admired deeply. One note in the margin caught her eye. Don't just build machines, build truth. She stared at the words for a long moment, then turned back to the laptop. The simulation had finished. Estimated efficiency, 99.1%. Stability, verified. Heat loss, 2.4%. Her breath caught. She blinked, half convinced she was imagining it, but the numbers didn't change. It had worked. Her hands trembled as she saved the results and backed them up in triplicate, external drive, cloud, and encrypted email to herself. Mia stood, eyes wide. You did it. I think so, Madeline whispered. I think I actually did. Mia reached for the coffee, now cold. Then let's go prove it to the guy who said you had one shot. But Madeline didn't move. Her gaze drifted to the folder on the desk, and then to the envelope she'd found weeks earlier, the one that led her to Gloria Harper. She hadn't opened it since, but now she pulled it out again, unfolding the paper slowly. Beneath, the original message, "Find Gloria Harper. She knew your mother." A second line had been scribbled in fresher ink. Stop chasing numbers. Start chasing Evelyn. Madeline's pulse quickened. She looked up at Mia, the weight of two worlds pressing down on her chest, one built on science, the other on blood. I'm going to Daniel's Tech tomorrow, she said, but after that I need to go to Cambridge. Mia nodded without hesitation. Then I'm coming with you. The elevator ride to the 16th floor of Daniel's Tech was smoother than Madeline expected. Polished metal walls, warm recessed lighting, and the faint scent of bergamot surrounded her as she clutched the small black case containing her prototype. She had rehearsed every word, every counter-argument, every potential question, but her palms were still damp, and her heart pounded like it wanted out. The elevator chimed. Doors slid open to a pristine hallway lined with frosted glass offices. A young assistant with an iPad greeted her without looking up. You're Madeline Whitman? She nodded. Mr. Daniels is expecting you. Conference room C. Her shoes tapped softly across the floor. Through the glass panels, she glimpsed sleek whiteboards filled with strategy diagrams and walls hung with photos of young founders shaking hands with venture capitalists. Every face smiled. Every hand was clean. She wasn't sure she fit here. Inside the room, Alex Daniels stood at the far end of a long table, back to her, staring out over downtown San Jose through a panoramic window. He turned only when she placed the prototype gently on the table. Right on time, he said. Right on results, she replied. Alex arched an eyebrow. Let's see them. She handed him the data binder and activated the prototype. The soft hum of the core filled the room as lights blinked in steady rhythm. She walked him through the specs: layered storage matrix, optimized thermal regulation, rapid discharge to outcome calibration. Every word was precise, every statistic supported by months of work. When she finished, Alex sat down and flipped through the graphs in silence. He didn't ask for clarification, didn't question the math. He just listened and thought, and occasionally glanced up at her like he was weighing something heavier than numbers. Why now? He asked, finally. She blinked. What do you mean? There are dozens of startups pitching me battery tech every year. None of them are this refined. So why hasn't anyone seen this before? Because they weren't supposed to, she said quietly. Not yet, not until I had no choice. Alex leaned back. Let me guess, family business, no inheritance, no support, just a little pride and a lot of grit. Madeline's jaw tightened. Close? Try no inheritance, no name, and a father who told me I was worth less than a chandelier cleaner." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Good. That kind of bitterness has range." She laughed once, a short burst. "Is that your investment strategy? Back the most wounded horse and hope it runs like hell?" Alex smiled, but his tone was dead serious. "I back survivors, and you're walking in here with something real." He stood, walked to the prototype, and circled it like a critic before a masterpiece. "I'll fund your next phase, lab access, engineers. I want a working pre-production unit in 3 months. Then we go to market." Madeline stared at him, barely breathing. "You're serious?" "I don't joke about money." She extended her hand. He took it. "One shot," he said again. "Don't waste it." Outside, the city buzzed beneath the evening sun, but Madeline barely felt the sidewalk under her feet as she left the building. The case with her prototype was tucked back under her arm, but everything else, the fear, the years of being overlooked, felt lighter. She crossed the street toward the bus stop when her phone buzzed. It was from an anonymous address. No subject, just a single line. "Langston Capital is preparing a board vote. You'll want to see what they're burying." She read it 3 times before looking up, the case in her arm suddenly feeling heavier again. The past wasn't done with her. And she wasn't done with it either. Cambridge in early spring was a strange in-between, where the air smelled like thawing ground and old brick, and the sky refused to make up its mind between blue and gray. Madeline stood on the front steps of 14 Grey Birch Lane, staring up at the narrow townhouse sandwiched between 2 weathered Victorians. Ivy clung to the stone like it had been there for decades, and the shutters hung slightly askew. She hesitated before knocking. The door opened faster than she expected, as if the woman on the other side had been standing there, waiting. Gloria Harper was smaller than Madeline remembered from the single black and white news photo she'd seen. Her once blonde hair had gone silver, pulled back into a loose braid. Her eyes were sharp, suspicious, but when she saw Madeline, something in her face softened. "Just barely. You look like her," Gloria murmured. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. "You knew Evelyn?" Gloria didn't answer. She stepped aside, gesturing Madeline inside with a nod. The interior smelled of paper and lemon oil, a mix of memory and preservation. Bookshelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of leather-bound volumes and accordion folders. Stacked boxes littered the floor, each one labeled in Gloria's neat cursive, "Langston Holdings 199820003 EW. Personal Whitman Legal Archives." Madeline followed her into the parlor, where a fire burned low behind a wrought iron grate. Gloria sat, without offering tea or small talk. "I never thought you'd come," she said, hands folded over her knee. "Your mother made me promise that if you ever did, I'd tell you everything." Madeline's fingers curled tightly in her lap. "Why didn't she ever try to contact me?" "She did." Gloria's eyes flickered with something bitter. "Letters, voicemails. I helped her file for joint custody. David crushed it before it ever saw court. He threatened to burn every last thing she owned if she went public." Madeline blinked hard. "He told me she died." "She didn't die." Gloria stood, walked to a nearby cabinet, and pulled out a box labeled EW, private. Inside was a single cassette tape and a worn envelope with Madeline's name on it. "Your mother recorded this a few days before she left New York for good. She wanted you to hear it when you were ready." Hands trembling, Madeline reached for the tape. The label was faded but legible. "For Maddie, 2003. "I don't have a player," she said quietly. Gloria nodded, crossed to the other room, and returned with a small tape recorder that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She pressed play. The crackle of static filled the room, followed by a voice, soft, warm, and heartbreakingly familiar. Madeline, my beautiful girl. If you're hearing this, then I wasn't able to protect you like I promised. I tried. I fought. But the man you call your father is not who you think he is. And Julia, she's not your sister, not by blood. They took everything from me, and now they're trying to take you too. Madeline covered, her mouth the weight of the truth slamming into her like a tidal wave. The voice on the tape continued, shaky but clear. I left proof, Maddie. Gloria knows where. I know someday you'll come looking. When you do, don't stop. Don't let them bury what they did. The tape clicked to a stop. Silence fell, broken only by the quiet ticking of a wall clock. Madeline looked up, eyes burning. Where is the proof? Gloria reached into her cardigan pocket and placed a small key on the table. It's in the Langston Archives, Storage Unit B-17. The storage facility on Long Island was nothing like Madeline expected. There were no steel corridors humming with security sensors, no polished floors, white and gloved curators. Just a row of aging warehouse units lined up like forgotten chapters, their corrugated walls streaked with rust and salt from years of Atlantic wind. The place reeked of damp cardboard and history no one wanted to remember. Unit B-17 sat at the far end of the property, isolated by a chain-linked fence that leaned slightly to the left. The padlock on the unit was old, but the key Gloria had given her fit smoothly. Madeline twisted it with care, as if the wrong angle might shatter everything. The door creaked upward, moaning like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, dust motes danced in beams of gray light. Cardboard boxes were stacked along one wall, many labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. Financial reports 1998, EW legal private, letters not sent. A plastic filing cabinet leaned precariously in the corner, one drawer slightly ajar, folders stuffed haphazardly inside. She stepped inside slowly, as though the floor might collapse beneath her. Her fingers brushed over the box marked letters not sent, and she froze. The first envelope bore her name, Maddie, your 10th birthday. I still see your smile when you opened the book on constellations. She stopped reading. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not now. She had come for something bigger, something concrete. She turned to the filing cabinet and opened the drawer fully. Folders slid forward with a metallic clatter. Near the back, wedged between two thick binders, was a slim manila folder stamped with the faded logo of Langston Capital. She opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of a will, unsigned but notarized, naming Madeline Whitman as co-founder and 40% stakeholder in Langston Capital. Attached was a handwritten note from Evelyn. David plans to cut me out. If anything happens to me, these documents must go to someone outside the board. I trust Gloria. I trust no one else. Taped to the final page was a grainy still image from a surveillance camera, time-stamped from over 2 decades ago. It showed David Whitman handing a document to a much younger Julia, her hair in a tight bun, her expression grim. The text message was simple. Power transfer, draft, June 2003. Madeline's breath caught. Julia hadn't just benefited from David's maneuvering, she had been part of it. A faint buzz broke the silence, her phone vibrating in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. A text from an unknown number again. The board meets in 5 days. If they vote, Langston becomes foreign-owned, and all of this dies in a vault. She stared at the screen, the weight of everything pressing into her chest. She looked back at the archive, at her mother's handwriting, at the proof Evelyn had risked everything to preserve. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about erasure, legacy, theft. She took photos of every page, scanning with precise, trembling hands. Then she packed the originals into her messenger bag, wrapped them in plastic to guard against rain. As she stepped out of the unit, the wind whipped her hair across her face. She looked back one last time, eyes narrowing at the rusted walls that had kept her family's truth locked away for so long. Not anymore. She locked the door, slipped the key back into her coat, and dialed Mia to be buried everything. Madeline said quietly, "But I've got the shovel now." And this time, she wouldn't stop digging. The 32nd floor of Langston Capital's Manhattan headquarters gleamed like power incarnate. Chrome fixtures, white marble, a conference room lined with windows that overlooked the city like a throne watches over its kingdom. It was the same building where David Whitman had once dragged a 7-year-old Madeline by the wrist, hissing at her not to touch anything unless it had her name on it. Now it did. She stood just outside the boardroom, her breath steady, eyes fixed on the frosted glass. Through it, silhouettes of the board members moved slowly. Men and women in suits worth more than most people's annual salaries. Julia Whitman sat confidently at the far end of the table, phone in hand, legs crossed, her voice faint but self-assured. Madeline could hear her laugh, soft and contained, like someone who had already won. The assistant glanced up from her desk. "You're on the agenda, Miss Whitman. 5 minutes for comments, no slides. No presentation." Madeline smiled thinly. "I won't need that long." Inside, the room fell into a polite hush as she entered. Some of the board members barely acknowledged her. An afterthought. David sat on the opposite end from Julia, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. For a man known for commanding silence with a single glance, he didn't raise his eyes to meet hers. "Miss Whitman," the chairman greeted her, flipping to the next page on his agenda. "We're mid-discussion on the international merger. You have a brief window before we move to vote." She stepped forward without hesitation and placed a black folder in the center of the table. "Before you vote on selling the last American-controlled energy asset in your portfolio, I suggest you read the documents inside. They concern the original founding structure of Langston Capital." Julia's brow twitched. David's hand tightened ever so slightly on the table's edge. The chairman opened the folder and scanned the top sheet, then the second, then the third. His eyes narrowed. "These are notarized declarations from Evelyn Whitman?" Madeline's voice was clear. "Co-founder, 40% original stake. Removed illegally, without due process, by David Whitman and Julia Whitman in 2003. Julia laughed, short and bitter. "Are we really entertaining ghost stories now?" Madeline didn't flinch. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small voice recorder, placing it gently beside the folder. A press of the button, a crackle. Then Evelyn's voice filled the room. "If anything happens to me, it will be because of David. He's rewriting everything. Julia's helping him. My daughter has a right to the truth." Silence fell like a shroud. David stood slowly, like a man preparing for war. "This is slander." "No," Madeline said evenly. "It's a deposition. The rest of it's in the care of a legal trustee in Boston, copies filed with the state, chain of custody intact." The chairman leaned back, visibly unsettled. "Ms. Whitman, you realize the gravity of what you're alleging?" "I do," she replied. "And I also realize this board has a legal responsibility not to proceed with any sale until these claims are reviewed." The conference room, once brimming with quiet arrogance, was now stone still. David's face was pale, jaw rigid. Julia, for the first time in years, looked unsure of herself. Madeline held their gaze for one beat longer. "You wanted to erase my mother, and me, but you forgot something." She turned to the board. "I'm still here." The air in the room grew thick, not with noise, but with something heavier, impending collapse. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if snapping out of a spell, several board members shuffled in their seats, murmuring to each other while flipping through the documents Madeline had brought. Pages rustled, eyes narrowed. One man leaned forward to whisper to the chairman. Another tapped furiously into his phone, searching for confirmation. The balance had shifted, and they all felt it. Julia leaned in, voice low and sharp. "This is a cheap stunt, Maddie. You think photocopies and a tape recorder changed decades of history?" Madeline turned her head slowly, meeting her gaze without blinking. "I think truth has a longer shelf life than you expected." Julia opened her mouth to respond, but was cut off when the chairman raised his hand. "We'll need time to review the legal standing of these claims," he said, "and until we determine the authenticity of this material, the vote on foreign acquisition is suspended." David's fist came down hard on the table. "You're being manipulated," he said, eyes darting from face to face, trying to recover his grasp. "This girl has no claim. Evelyn was declared incompetent before she disappeared. She had no legal authority over Langston Capital at the time these papers were written." "She wasn't incompetent," Madeline said. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. "She was threatened, lied to, and stripped of access to her daughter and her own company. Gloria Harper represented her until the day you had her disbarred. Gloria Harper was an unstable, bitter... She kept every file," Madeline cut in. "And I have her deposition, too." The room spiraled into debate. Half the board asked for immediate verification of Gloria's disbarment record. Others requested that Langston's legal team review the chain of documents Madeline had submitted. For the first time in 20 years, David Whitman's word was no longer law. It was subject to scrutiny. Madeline watched the unraveling calmly, but her heart pounded like a war drum inside her chest. This was what Evelyn had tried to stop. This was what they'd buried under layers of corporate control, press silence, and private threats. But the moment was here now, and she wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't the girl holding a damp diploma in the rain. She was a founder, a CEO, and a daughter with receipts. David's voice came again, quieter now, but pointed. "You're making a mistake. You think this will make you stronger, but you'll burn everything down, including yourself." Madeline leaned on the table, her hands steady. "You burned it down the day you decided your name was more valuable than your family." Then, without another word, she pulled out the final page in her folder, a document of stock acquisition, 22% ownership in Langston Capital, purchased silently over the past 6 months through anonymous shell companies, names traced to holding firms in Delaware and Nevada, none of which raised flags until now. She slid the page across the table. "Effective today," she said. "I'm invoking voting rights as the second largest stakeholder, which means this boardroom, this company, this is my house now too." The silence that followed was suffocating. Julia's face drained of color. David stood frozen, mouth parted, a man watching the empire he built dissolve beneath him in slow motion, and the chairman, reading the document with disbelief, finally looked up and asked quietly, "Is this real?" Madeline nodded once. Verified, filed, effective. No one said anything for several seconds. Then, quietly from the far end of the table, a slow clap broke the silence. One board member, then another, and in that moment, Madeline didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood taller, her voice calm and final. "This isn't about revenge. It's about restoration." She turned toward the door, not waiting for anyone to follow, her heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation marks to a chapter long overdue. The auditorium at the Chicago Energy Futures Summit pulsed with anticipation. Delegates from across the world packed the sleek modern hall, investors, scientists, policymakers, and journalists. Every chair was filled, every camera lens trained toward the stage. Behind the podium, a massive screen displayed a glowing emblem, Lunara's Impact Group, the name now etched into headlines, trade journals, and whisper networks across Silicon Valley. Backstage, Madeline adjusted the slim microphone at her collar, watching the countdown tick toward 0. She stood alone in a pool of soft light, her hands clasped in front of her, calm on the outside but alive with electricity inside. The past months had been a whirlwind, Langston's foreign deal buried, her stake publicized, and her leadership secured by a quiet board vote. David and Julia had receded into the background, their influence bleeding out like ink in water. She hadn't seen either since the confrontation in the boardroom, and now she stood here, not as someone's daughter, not as someone's shadow, but as the founder of a clean energy company that had just cracked the impossible. A voice came through her earpiece. "You're live in 5, Madeline," she nodded, exhaling slowly. As the screen on stage faded into darkness, she stepped forward into the spotlight. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and grounded. "My name is Madeline Whitman, and what I'm about to show you is not just a product, it's a turning point." A subtle murmur rippled through the crowd. She clicked the remote in her hand, and behind her a 3D schematic of Astrovolt Core 1 spun into motion. Its molecular structure illuminated in soft blue, layers of energy capture systems glowing as they pulsed. For decades, energy storage has been our greatest limitation. Solar without storage is incomplete. Wind without buffering is wasteful. But what if the way we stored energy was no longer a compromise? She walked slowly across the stage, her tone steady but passionate. Astrovolt Core 1 offers 99.1% storage efficiency, 0 lithium, fully recyclable, scalable from homes to cities. There was a sharp intake of breath in the room. This is what happens when you stop waiting for permission and start building what needs to exist, she said. We didn't just develop a new battery. We reimagined how energy fits into life, clean, abundant, and independent. Applause broke out across the front rows. Investors first, then journalists, then engineers who had followed her progress from the shadows. She paused to let the noise settle before lowering her voice, just slightly. "And yes, I know what some of you are thinking. Who is she? Where did she come from?" A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I came from a house where silence was more common than praise. From a family where power was inherited, not earned, and from a legacy that tried to decide who I could and couldn't be." She looked out into the crowd, locking eyes with no one and everyone. "I rejected that legacy." Behind her, the screen shifted to show a clean energy campus model, solar fields, vertical battery stacks, and a research lab named the Evelyn Center. "I built my own." The applause this time wasn't polite, it was thunderous. From the wings, Mia watched with tears in her eyes, her hand covering her mouth as Madeline continued. "When we launch Astrovolt Core 1 into production this fall, it won't be under someone else's banner. It'll be under Lunara, built by people who were underestimated, led by someone who once had nothing but a borrowed apartment and a sketch." Madeline let the final slide fade behind her as she stepped back from the mic. "And this," she said softly, "is just the beginning." The applause still echoed in the auditorium as Madeline stepped off the stage, breathless not from nerves but from something deeper. Release. Years of carrying names, secrets, silence, and now none of them defined her. Not anymore. Backstage, Mia rushed forward, eyes shimmering. "You were unstoppable." Madeline smiled, the edges of her mouth trembling with emotion. "So were you," she whispered, pulling Mia into a quick, fierce hug. Across the room, Alex Daniels approached, clapping slowly, a grin breaking across his usually composed face. "You just made history, Whitman." "Or is it still Whitman?" Madeline tilted her head. "Only on legal documents, but from now on I build under Lunara." He offered his hand. "To the future, then." She shook it, firm and certain. As the crowd began to disperse, Madeline moved toward the quiet of the reception lounge just beyond the main hall. She needed a moment away from the lights, the handshakes, the endless praise. She pushed open a glass door and stepped out onto a small terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. The air was cool and smelled faintly of the lake. From her purse, she retrieved a small, time-worn envelope, the one Gloria had given her but she hadn't opened until this morning. She unfolded it now with slow fingers. The letter inside was written in delicate cursive, the ink slightly smudged at the edges. My dearest, Maddie, I don't know when you'll read this. Maybe long after I'm gone, maybe in a world you've created on your own. But I want you to know none of this was your fault. The silence, the distance, the lies. You were never too much or not enough. You were always meant to lead, not follow. And when you do, build something beautiful, something they can't take away. Mom. Madeline pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closed, letting her mother's words settle into the quietest parts of her, the parts that still remembered the sting of being told she was nothing. She stayed there until the wind grew colder. That night, back in her hotel suite, she turned on the television as she packed her suitcase. A news anchor's voice played in the background. Astrovolt Core 1, developed by the recently launched Lunara's Impact Group, is being hailed as the most promising breakthrough in renewable energy since the solar cell. Founder Madeline Whitman, previously unknown in public markets, now leads the charge for the next era of energy independence. Her phone buzzed beside her, a text from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. We watched the broadcast. You did it. No name, but she knew who it was. She didn't reply. Some shadows deserved to stay behind glass. She turned off the television, zipped her suitcase, and looked out the window at the city glowing below. The empire he tried to pin had been built on control, deception, and silence. The one she built was born from truth. The next morning, Madeline boarded a flight not to New York or San Jose, but to a small town in Oregon, where Lunara's first solar field would break ground. She sat by the window, fingers resting lightly on her mother's letter. She didn't need the Whitman name. She didn't need revenge. She had something better at the beginning. Thank you for joining Madeline's journey. From exile to empowerment, from silence to a voice that could no longer be ignored. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or told you don't belong, let this story remind you. You don't need their approval to build something extraordinary. You don't need their name to carry your own legacy. Madeline didn't just expose a lie. She didn't just reclaim what was stolen. She built something they could never touch. Truth, purpose, and her own definition of power. This story is for every woman who was told to stay quiet, for every person who started from nothing and dared to rise anyway. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that echo the strength many try to silence. Because sometimes, the best revenge is becoming undeniable. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.